1 year after a bitter divorce, a billionaire CEO's ex-wife finds herself bussing tables to make ends meet. But when she looks up one evening and sees her ex-husband dining at one of her tables, her heart stops at the sight of the striking woman sitting beside him. The private dining room at Lune, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, was designed to impress. Ambient lighting cast a warm glow on the sleek, minimalist decor, where every detail, from the bespoke crystal glasses to the hand-folded linen napkins, whispered luxury. Seated at a table by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering skyline, Ethan Roberts leaned back in his chair, exuding effortless confidence. Across from him, Isabella Marquez, dressed in a black silk gown that seemed painted onto her lithe figure, let out a soft laugh. Her diamond earrings sparkled as she tossed her hair over her shoulder, fully aware of the heads turning to steal a glance at her. "I'm telling you, Ethan," Isabella said, her perfectly manicured hand tracing the rim of her wine glass. "If the merger goes through, we'll be looking at growth numbers no one else in the industry can touch. You, me, unstoppable." Ethan allowed himself a small, knowing smile. He knew she wasn't wrong. Isabella was sharp, ambitious, and had a knack for identifying opportunities before anyone else. It wasn't just her beauty that had drawn him to her. It was her relentless drive, so similar to his own. She was the kind of partner who matched him stride for stride, professionally and, if tonight went well, personally. "It's all about timing," Ethan said, his deep voice steady. "And the right alliances. Together, we'll make sure no one else even comes close." Isabella's eyes sparkled, her smile widening. Ethan could see she was hooked, and for a moment, he felt a surge of satisfaction. Everything about this evening was playing out perfectly, just as he'd planned. The restaurant had been handpicked for its exclusivity, the menu curated for its sophistication. Even the bottle of Chateau Margaux they were sharing was chosen for its symbolism, rare, refined, and unattainable to most. He reached for his glass and took a sip, savoring the rich, velvety red. His gaze drifted for a moment, skimming the other diners in the room. It was a habit of his, observing the people around him, calculating their stories, their ambitions, their worth. Most of them blurred into the background, hedge fund managers, celebrities, socialites. All people who either owed him favors or were trying to earn his attention. And then he saw her. At first, it didn't register. The woman in the crisp white shirt and black apron seemed out of place amid the opulence, but Ethan assumed she was just part of the restaurant staff. She moved between the tables with quiet efficiency, clearing plates and refilling glasses. There was a determination in her posture, a grace to her movements that caught his eye for a fleeting second. Then, as she turned to face him fully, his breath caught. It was Clara. For a moment, the world around him seemed to freeze. The sounds of clinking glasses and hushed laughter faded into a distant hum. Ethan's grip on his wine glass tightened as he stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the Clara James he used to know. His ex-wife. She didn't see him right away, too focused on clearing the remnants of an extravagant meal from a nearby table. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. Though she wore no makeup, her features were just as striking as he remembered: the high cheekbones, the soft curve of her jaw, the eyes that once held so much fire. But now, there was something else, a weariness, a shadow that hadn't been there before. "Ethan?" Isabella's voice cut through his haze. He blinked, tearing his gaze away from Clara to find Isabella watching him with a curious tilt of her head. "Everything all right?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with concern. Ethan forced a smile, though his chest felt tight. "Of course. Just thinking about what you said." Isabella seemed satisfied with that, returning to her monologue about market projections and strategic partnerships. Ethan nodded along, his responses automatic, but his attention kept flickering back to Clara. She moved with purpose, avoiding eye contact with the diners, her gaze fixed on her work. But when she turned again, her eyes met his. For a split second, they locked, and Ethan felt an almost physical jolt. Clara's expression didn't change, but he saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes before she quickly looked away. Her movements became brisker, almost hurried, as though she were trying to escape his line of sight. Ethan's mind raced. How had it come to this? The last time he'd seen Clara, they were standing in a courtroom, their marriage unraveling in front of a judge and a handful of lawyers. She had been proud, defiant, vowing to rebuild her life on her own terms. And now, here she was, bussing tables at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. The irony wasn't lost on him. Clara, who had once been his equal in every way, intellectually, emotionally, even financially, reduced to this. A pang of guilt crept in uninvited. Their divorce had been messy, but he had told himself at the time that it was what she wanted. She had walked away from their life together, from the wealth and status he had worked so hard to build. But seeing her now, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. Had he underestimated the toll it would take on her? Had he been too blind to her needs, too consumed by his own ambitions to see what she had been giving up? Ethan. Isabella's voice pulled him back again, sharper this time. She was frowning now, clearly irritated by his distraction. Sorry, he said quickly, setting down his glass. Just a lot on my mind. Isabella leaned forward, her voice dropping to a playful murmur. Well, let me help you forget about it, she said, her hand brushing his across the table. Ethan mustered another smile, but his focus was elsewhere. Across the room, Clara had disappeared, slipping into the kitchen with a tray of dishes. He couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest or the questions that now gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. What had happened to her in the years since their divorce? Why was she here, of all places? And why did it still matter to him? The perfect evening he had envisioned was beginning to unravel, the carefully constructed image of his life cracking at the edges. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Roberts felt unsure of his next move. Ethan's fingers hovered over the stem of his wine glass, but he didn't pick it up. His grip was too tense, his focus too scattered. Across the table, Isabella tilted her head slightly, her brows drawing together in subtle frustration. She was saying something about market positioning, something important, no doubt, but the words barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in a whirlwind of disbelief and unease. Clara. Here. It didn't make sense. The Clara he knew was ambitious and resilient, full of fire even in the worst of times. She had walked out of their marriage with her head held high, determined to carve out a life on her own terms. To see her here, bussing tables at a restaurant that catered to the elite, the very world she had once shared with him, was jarring. Ethan, Isabella said sharply, her voice cutting through his thoughts. Are you even listening? He blinked and met her gaze, forcing a smile that he knew didn't reach his eyes. Sorry, I got distracted for a moment. What were you saying? Her lips pursed, but she didn't press him right away. Instead, she took a measured sip of her wine, her eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to decipher his mood. I was saying, she repeated slowly, that we need to solidify the board's confidence before the merger announcement. Timing is everything. Ethan nodded, slipping into autopilot. Absolutely. Confidence is key. Isabella studied him for a moment longer, her irritation tempered by curiosity. You're distracted, she said plainly. Is everything all right? For a fleeting second, he considered telling her the truth. But the thought of explaining why his ex-wife was here, in this setting, was unthinkable. Isabella was many things, brilliant, ambitious, beautiful, but empathetic wasn't one of them. She would see Clara's presence as nothing more than a weakness in his otherwise pristine armor. Just a long week, Ethan said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. It's nothing. Let's focus on tonight. Isabella smiled faintly, but her eyes still lingered on him with a trace of suspicion. She didn't press further though, which he was grateful for. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to Clara. Yet even as he tried to steer his thoughts back to the conversation, his gaze kept drifting toward the kitchen doors. He hadn't imagined it, Clara had been there, and the look in her eyes when she saw him had been unmistakable. A flash of recognition, followed by something else. Embarrassment? Anger? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the memory of her expression. It was a stark contrast to the Clara he used to know, vivid and confident, unafraid to meet anyone's gaze, even his. A movement caught his eye, and there she was again. Clara emerged from the kitchen, carrying another tray of plates. Her steps were brisk but controlled, her posture straight despite the obvious fatigue etched into her face. She didn't look at him this time, her eyes fixed firmly on the task in front of her. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. Memories rushed in unbidden, her laughter on lazy Sunday mornings, the way she'd scrunch her nose when concentrating on a painting, the quiet moments they'd shared before everything fell apart. He remembered the fights too, the sharp words exchanged late at night, the way she had accused him of putting his career above their marriage. She had been right, of course. He'd been consumed by his ambition, blind to the toll it was taking on their relationship. And by the time he realized it, it had been too late. Clara moved to a table nearby, clearing empty glasses with practiced efficiency. For a moment, her gaze flicked up, meeting his once more. This time, her expression was guarded, her face a mask of professionalism. But he saw the flicker of something beneath it, an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent conversation that neither of them wanted to have. "Ethan," Isabella said again, her voice sharper now. "What is going on?" He turned back to her, startled by the edge in her tone. Her arms were crossed, her perfectly arched brows raised in an expression of growing impatience. "You've been distracted all night," she said. "You're looking at someone. Who is it?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of her question settling over him. Lying would be easy, but Isabella wasn't the type to let things go. If he brushed her off now, she'd only dig deeper later. "It's no one," he said finally, though he could hear the strain in his voice. "Just someone I thought I recognized." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "That woman," she said, tilting her head toward Clara's direction. "The one bussing tables. Is that who you're looking at?" Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. "It doesn't matter," he said carefully. "Can we drop it?" But Isabella wasn't letting it go. "Why are you so tense?" she pressed, her tone more curious than accusatory. "Do you know her?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. "She's someone I used to know." Isabella studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned back in her chair, her lips curving into a sly smile. "An ex?" she guessed. Ethan didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Isabella's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said lightly, though there was a sharpness to her tone, "I suppose everyone has a past." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was too busy replaying the fleeting moments of his encounter with Clara, the silent tension that lingered between them. He hadn't expected to see her again, let alone like this. Clara disappeared into the kitchen once more, and with her absence came a heavy silence at their table. Isabella was watching him closely, her sharp gaze probing for cracks in his composure. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked finally, her tone softer now, almost curious. Ethan shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "There's nothing to talk about." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. Clara's presence had stirred something in him, something he wasn't ready to face. And as the evening stretched on, he couldn't help but wonder if this encounter was a coincidence. Or a reckoning. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The image of Clara, head down, arms full of dishes, and moving purposefully through the restaurant, was etched into his mind. It clung to him like a shadow, following him home, into his cavernous penthouse, and settling in the quiet darkness of his bedroom. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a relentless tide. Clara had been the one person who had ever truly known him, the one who had seen past the polished facade to the man underneath. She had called him out on his ambition, challenged him to be better, and for a while, he thought he had been. But seeing her now, in that uniform, working a job that seemed so far removed from the life she once had, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been the one to push her there. The next morning, as he sat in his home office, sipping a cup of black coffee that had gone cold, the memories came rushing back. Clara had been a force of nature when they met. She was an artist, passionate and unapologetically bold, with a sharp wit that disarmed him from the moment they spoke. Ethan had been drawn to her like a moth to a flame. She wasn't impressed by his money or his status. In fact, she often mocked his corporate world as soulless. But she had loved him, not the billionaire CEO, but the man beneath the title. For a while, their differences had seemed like strengths. Clara grounded him, reminding him that there was more to life than quarterly earnings and strategic takeovers. Ethan admired her courage to pursue her art, even when it wasn't lucrative. But as his empire grew, so did the demands on his time and energy. Late nights at the office turned into missed dinners and broken promises. Clara tried to be patient, but resentment brewed, fueled by Ethan's growing detachment. He remembered their last major fight as if it had happened yesterday. Clara had been standing in the middle of their living room, her arms crossed and her face flushed with anger. "All you care about is winning," she had said, her voice trembling. "Your company, your image, your damn legacy. What about us, Ethan? What about me?" He had told her she didn't understand, that building something meaningful required sacrifices. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a cop-out. The truth was, he had stopped trying. He thought she would always be there, waiting for him, no matter how many times he put her second. When she finally filed for divorce, he hadn't fought it. Instead, he had buried himself in work, using his empire as a shield against the pain of losing her. His legal team had handled everything, ensuring that his assets remained protected. Clara had walked away with a fraction of what she was entitled to, and at the time, he hadn't given it a second thought. Now, in the cold light of morning, he felt the weight of that decision pressing down on him. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His assistant had left a stack of documents on his desk that needed his signature, but he couldn't focus. The guilt gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. He had always justified his actions by telling himself that Clara would land on her feet. She was strong, resourceful, she didn't need his money. But had he been wrong? The restaurant uniform, the exhaustion etched into her face, it didn't match the image of Clara he had held onto. She had once been so proud, so independent. Now, it seemed like life had worn her down in ways he couldn't ignore. Unable to shake the unease, Ethan picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He hesitated for a moment before dialing the number of an old mutual friend, someone who had stayed in touch with Clara after the divorce. "Ethan," the voice on the other end said, clearly surprised. "This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" "I need to know about Clara," Ethan said, cutting straight to the point. "How's she been? What's going on in her life?" There was a long pause. "Why do you care now?" the friend asked, their tone cautious. "You made it pretty clear when you split that you were moving on." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "But I saw her last night. She was working at Loon." The friend sighed, and Ethan could almost hear the weight of what they were about to say. "She's had a rough year. After the divorce, she tried to keep her studio open, but without the financial cushion she used to have, it was tough. Then her landlord raised the rent, and she couldn't keep up. She had to shut it down." Ethan's stomach sank. Clara's art studio had been her sanctuary, her dream. Losing it must have been devastating. "She took on some freelance work," the friend continued, "but it wasn't enough to cover everything. Eventually, she had to sell the house and move into a smaller apartment. She picked up shifts at the restaurant to make ends meet." Ethan was silent, the guilt settling deeper into his chest. He had known Clara was proud, that she would never ask for help, but he hadn't realized just how much she had lost. "She doesn't talk about it much," the friend added. "But I know it's been hard. She's been through a lot, Ethan." After ending the call, Ethan sat in silence, his mind racing. He thought of the woman he had seen at the restaurant, her head held high despite everything. Clara didn't belong in that world, not because she was above the work, but because it wasn't where her passion lay. She belonged in her studio, surrounded by her paintings, the smell of oil paint and turpentine in the air. And he had taken that from her. The realization hit him like a blow. His aggressive legal team, his refusal to give her more than the bare minimum, his selfish need to protect his empire, it had all contributed to her fall from grace. He had justified it at the time, telling himself that she had chosen to leave, that she didn't deserve a piece of what he had built. But now, it felt hollow. Cruel, even. For the first time in years, Ethan wondered if he had been wrong about everything. Clara had always been his equal, his partner. She had stood by him when no one else would have, and in return, he had let her down. The guilt was a heavy weight, one he wasn't sure he could carry. But beneath it was something else, a flicker of resolve. He didn't know what he could do to fix things or if Clara would even let him. But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The next evening, Ethan found himself back at Loon, though this time he wasn't entirely sure why. He had told himself it was to tie up loose ends from the night before, but the truth gnawed at him. He couldn't get Clara out of his mind, her weary determination, the way she had carried herself despite everything. Part of him hoped to talk to her, to find a way to make amends, even if he wasn't sure where to start. When Isabella suggested they return for a follow-up dinner to continue their conversation about the merger, Ethan had hesitated. But declining would have raised questions, and the idea of seeing Clara again tugged at him like a thread he couldn't leave loose. The restaurant was just as bustling as the night before, the air filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Ethan and Isabella were seated at a different table this time, one slightly closer to the kitchen. He scanned the room subtly, looking for Clara, but she was nowhere to be seen. Isabella didn't seem to notice his distraction, launching immediately into a conversation about a board meeting scheduled for later in the week. Ethan nodded along, offering the occasional comment, but his focus was half-hearted at best. When Clara finally emerged from the kitchen, balancing a tray of wine glasses, his heart lurched. She looked just as tired as before, though her movements were steady and precise. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair neatly tied back, but there was an air of resignation about her that Ethan hadn't noticed the night before. He couldn't stop himself from watching as she moved between tables, her gaze firmly fixed on her work. When she reached the table next to theirs, she began clearing away plates, her back turned to them. Isabella's voice cut through his thoughts. "You know," she said, leaning forward slightly, "it's always fascinating to me how some people never rise above their circumstances. They just stay where they are, doing the bare minimum to get by." Ethan's stomach tightened. He glanced at Clara, who had frozen for just a fraction of a second before continuing her work. The tension in her shoulders was subtle but unmistakable. "I mean," Isabella continued, clearly oblivious to the impact of her words, "look at the staff here. They're polite, sure, but you can tell they're just coasting. No ambition, no drive. It's why they'll always be stuck in jobs like this." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Clara beat him to it. She straightened up, turning to face Isabella with a calm, measured expression. Her eyes, however, burned with quiet defiance. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice steady and polite, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. "But I think you're mistaken. Ambition isn't measured by job titles or bank accounts. Sometimes it takes more strength to survive than it does to succeed." Isabella blinked, clearly caught off guard by the response. "I didn't mean," she began, but Clara wasn't finished. "I work here because I have responsibilities," Clara continued, her tone sharp but controlled. "Because I'm rebuilding my life after circumstances that were out of my control. That doesn't make me less ambitious or less worthy of respect." The nearby tables had gone quiet, the air heavy with tension. Isabella flushed, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Clara's words hung in the air, a pointed reminder of her resilience and strength. He couldn't let this escalate further. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He stood up, stepping between the two women. "Isabella, I think we need to move on from this conversation." Isabella's eyes flicked to him, confusion mingling with irritation. "Ethan, I didn't mean anything by it," she said, though her tone was defensive. "I know," Ethan replied evenly. "But it's not the time or place." Clara gave him a long, measured look, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might say more, but then she turned on her heel and walked away, her back straight and her head held high. Isabella watched her go, then turned back to Ethan, her brows furrowed. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice low. "Why are you so involved?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of her question settling over him. This wasn't how he had wanted things to unfold, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. "She's someone I used to know," he admitted finally, his voice quiet. Isabella tilted her head, her frown deepening. "An ex?" she guessed, her tone sharper now. "Yes," Ethan said, deciding there was no point in hiding it. "Her name is Clara." For a moment, Isabella didn't say anything, her gaze fixed on him as though trying to piece together a puzzle. "And she works here?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "She does," Ethan said simply, unwilling to elaborate further. Isabella leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You knew this, didn't you? That's why you've been so distracted." Ethan didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain the whirlwind of emotions he'd been grappling with since seeing Clara again. Guilt, regret, admiration, they all swirled together in a chaotic mix he couldn't untangle. Isabella sighed, shaking her head. "Well, that explains a lot," she said, her tone cool. "I'll be honest, Ethan, I'm not sure what to make of this." Ethan nodded, acknowledging her unease. "It's complicated," he said, his voice steady. "That much is clear," Isabella replied, her expression unreadable. The rest of the evening passed in a strained silence, the easy rapport they had shared before now fractured. Isabella was polite but distant, her attention fixed on her wine glass more often than on Ethan. As for Ethan, his thoughts remained fixed on Clara. Her words replayed in his mind, a stark reminder of the strength and resolve that had once drawn him to her. He couldn't ignore the way she had stood her ground, even in the face of someone like Isabella. When the dinner finally ended, Ethan escorted Isabella to her car, offering her a quiet apology for the awkwardness of the evening. She accepted it with a curt nod, though the tension between them lingered. As he watched her car disappear into the night, Ethan found himself lingering outside the restaurant, his gaze drifting back toward the entrance. Clara was still inside, no doubt finishing her shift. He didn't know what he would say to her if they crossed paths again. But one thing was certain, he couldn't keep ignoring the impact he had on her life, or the part of himself that still cared. Ethan lingered by his car, the cool night air brushing against his skin. Isabella was gone, the evening with her unraveling in a way he hadn't anticipated. He should have left too, driven home to the comfort of his penthouse and the sanctuary of solitude. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to go. His mind was still filled with Clara, her words, her defiance, the weight of what she had endured. When the restaurant doors opened and Clara stepped out, still dressed in her uniform, Ethan's breath caught. She didn't notice him at first, her head down, a worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Her steps were brisk, purposeful, but there was an exhaustion in her posture that tugged at something deep inside him. He didn't think twice. "Clara," he called out, his voice firm but quiet enough not to draw attention. She stopped mid-step, her shoulders tensing. For a moment, she seemed to debate whether to keep walking, but then she turned, her expression a mixture of annoyance and wariness. "What do you want, Ethan?" He approached her cautiously, hands in his pockets as if that would make him seem less imposing. "We need to talk." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "We don't need to do anything." "Clara, no." She cut him off, her voice sharp. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. You've done enough." The words stung, but Ethan held his ground. "I'm not here to fight with you," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. I need to understand. Why are you working here? What happened?" Her eyes flashed with anger. What happened? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. You happened, Ethan. Your lawyers, your settlement, your indifference, it all happened. He flinched, guilt tightening his chest. I didn't know things were this bad. Of course you didn't. She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. You don't see anything outside of your perfect little bubble. You have no idea what it's like to struggle, to have to start over from nothing. I didn't think you'd... He stopped himself, realizing too late how the words would sound. You didn't think I'd end up here? Clara finished for him, her voice dripping with sarcasm. That's because you didn't think about me at all. Not during the divorce, not after. You moved on and left me to pick up the pieces. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her accusation settling over him. She was right. He had been so focused on protecting his empire, his image, that he hadn't stopped to consider what the fallout would mean for her. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said quietly. I thought you'd be fine, she interrupted. Yeah, I know. That's the problem, Ethan. You thought. You assumed. But you never asked? He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, realizing he had no defense. She was right, he hadn't asked, hadn't cared enough to look beyond his own priorities. Clara sighed, the anger in her expression softening slightly, replaced by a weariness that cut even deeper. Look, I don't need your pity, she said. I don't need you swooping in to fix things now because you suddenly feel guilty. I'm not here to pity you, he said quickly, taking a step closer. I'm here because I care. Her laugh was softer this time, but no less bitter. Care? Since when, Ethan? You didn't care when I begged you to prioritize us. You didn't care when your legal team made sure I walked away with next to nothing. So why now? Because I was wrong, he admitted, the words feeling both foreign and necessary. I made mistakes, Clara. I see that now. I can't change the past, but I want to help. Her gaze hardened again. Help? How exactly? By throwing money at me? Buying me a better job? You don't get it, do you? I don't want your charity. I don't want anything from you. Her words hit like a blow, but he didn't back down. This isn't about charity. It's about doing what I should have done a year ago. And what's that? She challenged. Make yourself feel better? Ease your conscience? Ethan shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. Why are you so determined to push me away? Because I've had to rebuild my life from the ground up, she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. Every step I've taken, every decision I've made, has been mine. I've fought for my dignity, Ethan. I'm not going to let you take that away from me now. He didn't know what to say to that. For a man who thrived on control, who always knew the right words to sway a boardroom or seal a deal, he felt utterly lost in front of her. Clara exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. I don't need your help, she said more softly this time. I'm okay, Ethan. I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'll get there. On my own. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't have to do it alone, but the resolve in her eyes stopped him. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the fierce, independent force of nature who refused to let anything or anyone define her. Okay, he said finally, his voice quiet. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything. I won't, she said firmly, cutting him off. He nodded, though it hurt more than he expected. All right. But for what it's worth, I am sorry, Clara. For everything. She didn't respond right away, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, she turned and walked away, her steps purposeful and steady. Ethan watched her go, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He had come here looking for answers, hoping to ease his guilt, but instead, he had been forced to confront just how deeply he had failed her. For the first time in years, Ethan Roberts felt powerless. And as Clara disappeared into the night, he realized that the road to redemption, if it even existed, would be one he had to walk alone. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, the city skyline spread out before him like a glittering canvas. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of traffic below. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table beside him, the amber liquid catching the light. He hadn't been able to stop replaying his conversation with Clara. Her words echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. She didn't need him. She didn't want his help. And while part of him respected her for that, another part couldn't help but ache at the thought of how far they had drifted from the people they used to be. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. Memories surfaced unbidden, pulling him back to a time when things had been different, when Clara had been his whole world. They had met at a charity gala, one of those lavish affairs filled with champagne and meaningless small talk. Ethan had been bored, scanning the room for familiar faces, when he saw her. She was standing by the buffet table, holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres she didn't seem interested in eating. Her dress was simple, understated compared to the opulence around her, but she carried herself with a confidence that made her stand out. He had approached her, intrigued by the way she seemed untouched by the pretentiousness of the event. Their conversation had been easy, flowing from one topic to another. Clara had been unlike anyone he had ever met, sharp-witted, passionate, and unafraid to challenge him. She didn't care about his wealth or his reputation. She cared about who he was beneath it all. Those early days had been a whirlwind of discovery. They spent late nights talking about everything and nothing, exploring the city together, and dreaming of a future where they could merge their worlds. Clara had been a painter then, her small studio tucked away in a corner of the city. She had shown him her work one night, her hands stained with paint as she explained the meaning behind each piece. "This one's about possibility," she had said, gesturing to a vibrant canvas of swirling colors. "The idea that even when things feel stagnant, there's always something waiting to break through." Ethan had loved that about her, the way she saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. She had made him feel grounded, alive in a way his corporate world never could. For a time, he believed they could balance each other out. But as the years went on, cracks began to form. Ethan's company was growing rapidly, demanding more and more of his time. He thrived on the pressure, the thrill of closing deals and outmaneuvering competitors. But his success came at a cost. Late nights turned into missed dinners. Vacations were postponed, then cancelled altogether. His phone was always ringing, pulling him away even when he was home. Clara had tried to be patient. She understood his ambition, even admired it at times. But she also saw how it consumed him, how it left little room for anything else. One evening, she had confronted him, her voice trembling with frustration. "Ethan, you're not here. Even when you're home, you're somewhere else. I feel like I'm competing with your work, and I'm losing." He had brushed her off, telling her that it was temporary, that things would settle down once the company reached its next milestone. But things never settled. There was always another deal, another project, another goal just out of reach. The fights became more frequent, their once effortless connections strained under the weight of unmet expectations. Clara had wanted a simpler life, one where they could focus on each other and the things that truly mattered. But Ethan had been too consumed by his drive for success to see what he was losing. The final blow came on their 5th anniversary. Clara had planned a quiet evening at home, complete with a homemade dinner and a gift she had spent weeks preparing. But Ethan had forgotten. He had been caught up in a last-minute meeting, only realizing his mistake when he returned home to find her waiting, the candles on the table burned down to stubs. "I can't do this anymore," she had said, her voice breaking. "I've tried, Ethan. I've tried to make this work, but I can't be the only one fighting for us." He had stood there, speechless, as she packed a bag and walked out the door. The divorce that followed had been swift and clinical, handled by lawyers with little input from either of them. Ethan had buried himself in work, using it as a shield against the pain of losing her. Now, sitting in the dim light of his penthouse, Ethan felt the weight of those memories pressing down on him. He had told himself that he was doing the right thing, that his sacrifices were necessary for the life he was building. But at what cost? Clara had been right, he had been absent, not just physically but emotionally. He had prioritized his empire over their marriage, convinced that success would make up for his shortcomings. But seeing Clara now, working at a restaurant to make ends meet, he realized how blind he had been. For all his achievements, Ethan felt a profound emptiness. His penthouse, his cars, his accolades, none of it mattered in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. He had built an empire, but he had alienated the one person who had truly seen him. Ethan stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city below. The lights stretched on endlessly, a testament to his ambition. But for the first time, they felt hollow, a reminder of everything he had lost in his pursuit of more. He thought of Clara's words, her refusal to accept his help. She was rebuilding her life on her own terms, just as she always had. It was a strength he admired, even if it made him feel powerless to atone for his mistakes. Ethan exhaled, his breath fogging the glass. He didn't know if he could ever make things right with Clara. But one thing was clear, he couldn't keep living the way he had been. Success had come at too high a price, and it was time to reevaluate what truly mattered. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name, a desire not for power or prestige, but for meaning. And though he didn't know where it would lead, he knew he had to start somewhere. The city never truly slept, and neither did its insatiable appetite for scandal. Ethan awoke the next morning to the persistent buzzing of his phone. He groaned, rolling over to grab it from the nightstand. His notifications were flooded, texts, emails, and missed calls, all demanding his attention. He opened a message from his assistant, Hannah, marked urgent. "Ethan, you need to see this." The link led to a gossip blog, the headline screaming in bold letters. "Billionaire Ethan Roberts' dinner drama, spotted with ex-wife turned waitress?" Beneath it was a grainy photo taken at Loon. It showed Ethan standing close to Clara, his face tense, her expression equally fierce. Isabella was visible in the background, her icy glare directed at the scene. The article speculated wildly about Ethan's relationship with both women, painting a lurid picture of a love triangle. Ethan swore under his breath, scrolling further. The piece didn't stop at speculation. It had dug into Clara's recent life, describing her struggles with alarming accuracy, her failed art studio, her financial troubles, and her current job at the restaurant. The tone was patronizing, framing her as the fallen ex-wife of a man who had everything. He tossed the phone onto the bed and ran a hand through his hair. The article wasn't just invasive, it was cruel. Clara had always valued her privacy, and now her life was being dissected for the world to see. Worse, it painted him as the villain, the detached billionaire who had abandoned her to fend for herself. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Hannah, looking unusually tense. "They're all over this," she said, stepping into the room. "Every major outlet is picking it up. Stockholders are asking questions. And Isabella, well, you should probably talk to her." Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Where is she?" "She called a meeting," Hannah replied. "She's waiting downstairs." Ethan dressed quickly, his mind racing as he made his way to the living room. Isabella was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, her arms crossed and her expression colder than he'd ever seen. A tablet rested on the coffee table, displaying the same article he had just read. "Explain," she said as soon as he entered, her tone clipped. "It's not what it looks like," Ethan began, though the words felt hollow even to him. "The article's exaggerated." Clara and you what?" Isabella interrupted, her voice rising. "You're spotted with your ex-wife, who, by the way, the world now knows is working as a waitress, and you didn't think to mention any of this to me? Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" Ethan frowned. "This isn't about you, Isabella." Her eyes narrowed. "Of course it's about me. I'm your partner, professionally and until now, personally. This kind of scandal reflects on both of us." "She didn't ask for this," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Clara has nothing to do with you or the merger. She's just trying to live her life. And yet her name is in every headline alongside yours." Isabella snapped. "You're being painted as the heartless ex who abandoned her, and I'm the opportunistic new girlfriend. Do you think that's good for business? For my reputation?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. I can't control what the press writes. And I'm not going to cut ties with Clara just because they're making a story out of nothing. Isabella's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. Cut ties? Ethan, you shouldn't have any ties with her. She's your ex-wife. Whatever guilt you feel, it's not your responsibility to fix her life. He took a step closer, his tone low but firm. You don't know anything about her, Isabella. Clara is the strongest person I've ever met. She doesn't need me to fix her life, she's already doing that herself. What she doesn't need is people like you looking down on her. Isabella's jaw tightened, her expression icy. This isn't about her, Ethan. This is about you and me. I've worked too hard to let some tabloid scandal derail everything I've built. If you're serious about us, you'll cut ties with Clara and make a statement clarifying your position. Ethan stared at her, the weight of her ultimatum settling over him. For years he had thrived in a world of deals and compromises, of weighing risks against rewards. But this wasn't a negotiation he was willing to make. She's not part of our lives, Isabella continued, her voice softening slightly. Let her go. Focus on us. Ethan exhaled, his gaze drifting to the city skyline behind her. For all her beauty and ambition, Isabella didn't understand. She didn't see the humanity in this situation, the way Clara had been thrust into the spotlight against her will. And she didn't see the man Ethan wanted to be, not the one who ignored the consequences of his actions, but the one who faced them. No, he said finally, his voice steady. I'm not going to abandon Clara just to make things easier for us. She's been through enough because of me. If you can't handle that, maybe this isn't going to work. Isabella's eyes widened, shock flickering across her face. You're choosing her over me? It's not about choosing, Ethan said, his tone resolute. It's about doing what's right. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, Isabella picked up her bag, her expression cold and unreadable. Good luck with that, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Without another word, she walked out, leaving Ethan alone with the city's quiet hum. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door she had closed behind her. The path he had chosen wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, it felt like the right one. Turning back to the window, Ethan resolved to face the fallout head-on. If the world wanted a story, they would get one, but it would be one of accountability, of acknowledging his mistakes, and of finding a way to make things right, no matter how difficult it might be. Clara deserved that much. And so did he. The days that followed were a whirlwind of chaos. Ethan's office was flooded with calls from PR consultants, board members, and media outlets, all clamoring for a response to the scandal. Isabella's departure from his life had barely registered amid the noise, her cold goodbye echoing faintly in the back of his mind. For all the urgency swirling around him, Ethan's focus remained fixed on one thing: Clara. The thought of her life being exposed to the public, her struggles paraded as entertainment, made his stomach churn. He had contributed to this, indirectly or not. The guilt was a constant companion, urging him to act. But this time, it wasn't about easing his own conscience. It was about doing what he should have done a year ago, acknowledging her pain, owning his part in it, and giving her the respect she deserved. He called the restaurant where Clara worked, learning her schedule from a reluctant manager. It felt invasive, but he didn't want to ambush her during a shift. If they were going to talk, it had to be on her terms. The following evening, Ethan arrived at a small park near her apartment. The information had been easy to find, too easy, he realized, thinking again of how little privacy Clara now had. He waited by a bench near the fountain, rehearsing the words he needed to say but unsure how she would receive them. When Clara appeared, walking home after her shift, she didn't notice him at first. Her bag was slung over her shoulder, her steps unhurried but purposeful. As she drew closer, her gaze met his, and she stopped in her tracks. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice wary. "I need to talk to you," he said, standing. Please. She sighed, glancing around the park. It was late, the paths quiet except for a few joggers in the distance. After a long pause, she stepped closer, crossing her arms. Fine, she said. Talk. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I'm sorry, he said finally. For everything. For the way the divorce went, for how I handled things. I was selfish, and I didn't think about what it would mean for you. Clara's expression didn't soften. You're right. You didn't. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. I saw what happened with the press, how they've dragged your life into the spotlight. I know I can't undo that, but I want to help. Not with money, he added quickly, seeing the flash of anger in her eyes. But with whatever you need. Support, connections, anything. Clara shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. Ethan, you still don't get it, do you? I don't need you to swoop in and save me. I've been through hell this past year, but I've made it through on my own. And I'm proud of that. I know you are, Ethan said softly. And I respect that more than you know. This isn't about me trying to fix things for you. It's about trying to show you that I understand now, even if it's too late. Her eyes softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. Why now? She asked. Why are you here after all this time? Because seeing you again reminded me of what I lost, Ethan admitted. Not just you, but the person I was when I was with you. I've spent so much of my life chasing success that I forgot what it meant to be human. You were my anchor, Clara, and I let you go. Clara's gaze didn't waver, but the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken emotion. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but firm. Ethan, I'm not the same person I was when we were married. And neither are you. Whatever you're looking for, closure, redemption, I can't give it to you. I'm not asking you to, he said quickly. I just want you to know that I see you. I see how strong you are, how much you've overcome. And I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, I'm here. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I appreciate the apology, she said finally. And I hope you mean it. But I don't need a second chance with you, Ethan. I need to keep moving forward. On my own. Ethan felt a pang of regret, but he nodded, understanding. I get it, he said. I do. And I hope you know that I'll always root for you, wherever life takes you. Clara smiled faintly, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her all evening. Thank you, she said. But I've got this. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps confident and unhurried. Ethan watched her go, his heart heavy but strangely light at the same time. She didn't need him. She never had. And while that truth stung, it was also freeing. Clara would be okay. She would thrive. As he turned back toward the fountain, Ethan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. His life had been built on ambition, on chasing the next big thing. But ambition had cost him more than he had realized. It was time to stop running, to face himself honestly and find meaning beyond the boardroom. For Clara, the path forward was clear. For Ethan, it was just beginning. But for the first time, he welcomed the uncertainty. Because now, he knew what truly mattered, not the success he had always chased, but the connections he had too often ignored. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to rebuild. Not with Clara, but with himself. Part 9: Closure. Ethan lingered in the park for a long time after Clara walked away, the faint echoes of her words settling like dust around him. She didn't need him. She never had. And for the first time, he understood that her strength wasn't something he had built but something she had always possessed. It was the reason he had loved her, the reason he still admired her, even as they stood on separate paths. The next day, he made one last attempt to bring closure, not to her life, but to his own. Ethan called his assistant and asked her to cancel all his meetings. For once, the empire could wait. He needed time to think, to act, and to finally put to rest the guilt he had carried for so long. The first stop was his company. Ethan met with his board, laying out plans that had been brewing in the back of his mind for weeks. He proposed stepping back from day-to-day operations, transferring more power to his executive team. It was time for him to let go of the reins, not just for Clara's sake but for his own. His life had been consumed by his pursuit of success, and he was ready to rediscover what he had lost in the process. The board was shocked but supportive, their respect for him tempered by the understanding that even the most driven men needed room to breathe. Ethan left the meeting with a sense of relief, knowing that he had taken the first step towards something new. Next, he made a quiet gesture that he hoped would bring Clara some peace. Through an anonymous donation, he contributed to a grant for emerging artists, ensuring that others like her would have the opportunities she had once struggled to find. It wasn't about redemption, it was about honoring the woman she had been and the resilience she had shown. Weeks passed, and Ethan found himself in a different rhythm. His days were quieter, filled with moments of reflection and small joys he hadn't noticed before. He visited art galleries, attended community events, and even spent time reconnecting with old friends he had long neglected. Slowly, the weight of his past began to lift. One evening, as he was walking through the city, Ethan passed by a gallery hosting a new exhibit. Drawn by curiosity, he stepped inside. The space was alive with energy, the walls adorned with vibrant, evocative paintings. At the center of it all was a familiar name, Clara James. He moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning the artwork. Each piece told a story, raw and unflinching, but there was a thread of hope woven through them. It was as if Clara had taken every hardship, every loss, and transformed it into something beautiful. Toward the back of the gallery, he found her. Clara was speaking to a small group, her hands gesturing animatedly as she explained the inspiration behind one of her pieces. She looked different now, radiant, confident, completely at ease in her element. Ethan stayed at a distance, not wanting to intrude, but his heart swelled with pride. As the crowd thinned, Clara's eyes met his across the room. She paused, her expression unreadable, before excusing herself from the conversation. She approached him with measured steps, her head held high. "Ethan," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" "I saw your name," he admitted. "I wanted to see your work." Clara nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "And? It's incredible," he said honestly. "You've always been incredible." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. "I just wanted to say one last thing," he said. "I'm proud of you, Clara. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for the person you are. I know I didn't always see that when we were together, but I see it now." Clara studied him, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that," she said. "And I hope you've found what you're looking for too." "I'm getting there," Ethan replied with a faint smile. "It's a work in progress." Clara's smile widened, and for the first time in a long time, there was no tension between them. Just understanding. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said, her voice warm but final. "You too," he replied. Clara turned and walked back into the gallery, her presence commanding yet light. Ethan watched her go, a sense of closure settling over him. She was thriving, and that was enough. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Ethan felt a strange calm wash over him. For years, he had been driven by ambition, by guilt, by the need to control. But now, for the first time, he felt free. Not because he had fixed anything, but because he had finally learned to let go. And with that, Ethan Roberts walked into the night, ready to embrace the uncertain but hopeful path ahead. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder that success isn't measured by wealth or titles but by the relationships we nurture and the impact we leave on others. Clara's journey shows us the resilience of the human spirit and the strength it takes to rebuild on our own terms. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments, What does redemption mean to you? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.